Descartes and Vasubandhu seem to both doubt the existence of the self upon first glance, but the metaphysics of God plays an important role in shaping both Descartes' and Vasubandhu's philosophies of dualism and idealism, respectively. Descartes relies on the existence of God to prove he has knowledge of the outside world, while Vasubandhu's denial of such an entity prevents him from trusting his sensory perceptions. Dualism is the philosophical view that the mind exists apart from the body. This means that one's mind, although connected to a body in some way, is a separate entity than one's body. Throughout the history of philosophy, different aspects of the mind have been featured in different brands of dualism. The view in question in this study is Cartesian dualism. Cartesian dualism was founded by French philosopher René Descartes and is the cornerstone of all modern forms of dualism. Descartes first laid out the groundwork for his dualism in Meditations. In it, he outlines what is called substance dualism, a view in which there are two different kinds of substance. Matter is physical substance. It is extended in space and time. And mind substance is essentially a substance that thinks. This is illustrated in Descartes' famous cogito argument. Descartes begins the Meditations by getting rid of all things whose existence is possible to doubt. Anything that is perceived via sensory experience must go because of the evil demon argument. Descartes imagines that there is an evil demon so powerful that he can cause Descartes to perceive things that in fact are not there. Now extrapolate this idea further. Imagine the evil demon is causing him to perceive the entire world around him and everything in it. While it may seem counterintuitive at first, this type of reasoning is purely logical and entirely plausible. For a more modern example, imagine yourself trapped in the Matrix. Everything seems entirely real, but it is still an illusion. Imagine seeing a person walking toward you from a distance. The sun is shining into your eyes and you mistakenly think that it is a good friend of yours. You rush over to meet them, but when you get closer, you see that it is in fact a complete stranger. It is entirely possible for one's perceptions to misrepresent reality. Descartes has now come to doubt the existence of the entire exterior world. This brings Descartes to possibly the most famous argument in the philosophy of mind, the cogito ergo sum argument. In his second meditation, Descartes compares having knowledge of the body to having knowledge of the mind. He cannot even be sure that his own body exists, since he relies on his perceptions to see, feel, hear, smell, and, if necessary, taste his own body. The only thing that he cannot doubt the existence of is his mind, for in order to doubt, there must exist a mind to do the doubting. From this train of thought, Descartes arrives at the conclusion, cogito ergo sum, which in Latin means, I think, therefore I exist. Now that Descartes has true knowledge that he exists, he can now set to the task of claiming more knowledge for himself. In Meditation 3, Descartes concludes that perception and imagination exist, as they are modes of consciousness in his mind. But before he can go any further, Descartes must be sure that both perception and imagination have any grounds in truth. To do this, Descartes feels he needs to prove the existence of God. If God exists, he will be omnipotent, infinite, and perfect. His argument rests on the belief that it is not possible for a finite being to imagine an infinite being. The infinite being must therefore have existed before the finite being. A more sophisticated form of this argument is found in Meditation 5. It is called the ontological argument. The ontological argument comes in many forms, because its name simply means an argument that seeks to prove the existence of God through pure reason. It uses analytic, a priori premises that do not rely upon observation. Descartes' ontological argument rests on his picture of God being a supremely perfect being. Roughly speaking, the argument goes like this. I have an idea of a supremely perfect being, that is, a being having all perfections. Necessary existence is a perfection. Necessary existence means I cannot possibly think of a world in which that which has necessary existence did not exist. Therefore, a supremely perfect being exists. According to Descartes, a supremely perfect being that does not exist is just as much a contradiction as a triangle whose interior angles do not sum up to 180 degrees. Now that Descartes has proven the existence of God, he has no reason to doubt his perception or imagination. A supremely perfect being such as God would not allow him to be deceived when it comes to things like the sensory perception of the world around him. Meditations 5 and 6 are Descartes' personal reflections on the existence of material substances. Because he now has certain knowledge that God exists, or so he thinks, he can trust his God-given senses of perception to not deceive him about the external world outside of his mind. The external world, therefore, exists with genuine certainty. Descartes has proven the existence of the mind and of the external world, of which the body is a part. Exactly how it is possible that these two separate and distinct kinds of substances are able to interact with each other is a discussion for another time. We will now move on to Vasubandhu's idealism. While it is currently the topic of much discussion whether or not Vasubandhu was actually an idealist, a cursory look at his philosophy reveals many similar characteristics between Vasubandhu's ideas and the basic concepts of idealism. Idealism is the philosophical view that denies the existence of the physical world. All that does exist, in fact, is the content of our mental life. The most famous champion of this view is Bishop Berkeley. He says that pieces of sense data are called ideas. These are all things that can be immediately known, such as memories, products of our imagination, our own thoughts, and perceptions. The only reason the coffee cup on my desk, which I perceive with my sense of sight, exists is because I perceive it. It is important to note that Berkeley did believe in an external world, but this world is nothing more than an idea in the mind of God. Like Descartes' dualism, Berkeley's idealism relies on the existence of God. This is important to keep in mind when comparing these philosophies to that of Vasubandhu. Vasubandhu believes in the non-existence of the dharmas. The dharmas, according to Vasubandhu's Vijnanavadin, are composed of many things, and do not exist. This is analogous to a forest or a battalion not existing. These are just names of large groups of smaller objects. They are made up of three gunas, which would be subject to change if they were identical to the dharmas. But the Samkhyas would not accept this idea. If the three gunas were identical to the dharmas, then the substances would be identical in activity. But this is nonsensical. Since the substances have numerous activities, there would also be numerous substances. But one cannot be many, so this idea is absurd. Vasubandhu argues away the rest of the categories in a way similar to idealism. All other categories, such as dravya, are designations for things perceived by consciousness. Like Bishop Berkeley, Vasubandhu holds that the external world cannot exist for certain because we can only perceive it through the senses. A major reason the sense cannot be trusted is that Vasubandhu does not believe in a supremely perfect being. The main point of dissent between Descartes and Vasubandhu is that Vasubandhu denies the existence of an omnipresent eternal being. That which produces is not eternal. That which is not eternal cannot be omnipresent. That which is not omnipresent is not real. He argues that if there was an eternal, omnipresent being, complete with all Shakti capabilities, he should be producing all dharmas in all places at all times, which does not happen. Having laid down a base of Vasubandhu's metaphysics, we will turn to his concept of self. Vasubandhu addresses three different views of the existence of the self. The first is the idea that the self is eternal, universal, and extensive as infinite space. This cannot be, he says, because if the self is eternal and universal, it will be everywhere at once. With this in mind, it is difficult to see how the self could enjoy or suffer individually. Vasubandhu also questions how it is that the self can be mobile if it is everywhere. It would have to be motionless. Furthermore, if the self is common, then whenever one person experienced anything, all people would have to experience that same thing. This idea is absurd, but if the self is distinct under the same universal view, all different selves will universally penetrate each other, and then the substance of all selves will be mixed up. The second concept Vasubandhu discusses comes from Jainism, which says that the self is eternal but is relative to the size of the body. The simple response to this is that an eternal self cannot expand or contract relative to the size of a body, because this contradicts what it means to be eternal. The final working of the self Vasubandhu considers comes from the Pasupatas, who believe that the self is eternal, but it is subtle like an atom. Such a theory is incomprehensible to Vasubandhu. How it is that such a small self can cause the entire body to act, he does not know. Vasubandhu's Vijnanavadan outlines two different kinds of belief in the self: natural belief and belief produced from mental discrimination. He calls these Anmatgraha and Sahaya, respectively. He thinks that natural belief in the self can be eliminated through meditation and self-cultivation on the path of Bhavana Marga, and belief in the self from mental discrimination is done away with when the ascetic contemplates the ultimate reality, which is realized by the voidness of the self and things. For Vasubandhu, the self is just a series of bundles of perceptions. Like Descartes, Vasubandhu believes that the only thing one can initially believe exists is the mind and its thoughts. Because Vasubandhu rejects the existence of a god, he has no just reason to trust his perceptions. But Vasubandhu takes this step an idea further, saying that the self is actually just consciousness. At every given moment, the consciousness is experiencing any number of perceptual inputs, and our concept of self is nothing more than the series of these bundles over time. Furthermore, these bundles of consciousness are momentary and impermanent. When one bundle ceases to exist, the next series begins, and when the next bundle exists, the previous one goes out of existence. Under this view, there is no enduring self. The existence of God is the foundation for all of Descartes' knowledge outside of the knowledge of his own existence. Imagine adopting the ruminations in the first and second meditations, but having to stop there. That is where Vasubandhu would fall. Without an eternal and omnipresent, perfect God, Descartes cannot be sure of any knowledge other than, I exist. It is important to note that while the initial beliefs of Descartes and Vasubandhu are similar, they differ on an important issue: the concept of self. Upon immediate understanding, they both appear to believe that the only true knowledge is that of one's own personal existence. But Vasubandhu does not even believe that he himself exists. He believes that what he mistakenly designates as himself is nothing but a series of bundles of momentary and fleeting perceptions, each one ceasing to exist immediately after it comes into being. Some objections can be brought up against Vasubandhu's theory of the self. If what we call the self is nothing but a set of momentary conscious states, then it is difficult to see exactly how any sort of karmic debt can be incurred or repaid. For it seems contradictory for one to be expected to repay lifetimes of karmic debt when there exists no one person to incur that debt in the first place. Similarly, the concepts of reincarnation become absurd under this view of the self. But such confusing paradoxes are the nature of Buddhism to begin with, an attempt to get one to think outside of one's skin and broaden her mind to concepts beyond that which we see, hear, feel, smell, and taste. It is because of this objection that Descartes' view of the self is more plausible. Both Descartes' ontological argument for the existence of God and Vasubandhu's ontological argument against the existence of God are shaky at best. There is no defense of Vasubandhu's premise, that which produces is not eternal. Descartes' premise that a supremely perfect being has the characteristic of existence is suspicious. Descartes needs to show that the concept of a supremely perfect being is first coherent. But as a final thought, one must seriously consider how a distinct body and a distinct mind can have any causal effect on one another. It cannot work by magic alone, and many philosophers have tackled this problem to no avail. While Cartesian dualism may seem like a more plausible view compared to Vasubandhu's idealism, it is not without its own peculiar flaws.